We're here for a presentation by Dr. Jennifer Minner, who joins us from Cornell University today. And her talk is going to be on, I have to read it because she gave us two titles and then actually went with a third. But the talk is actually on mega events, which are impact craters and reservoirs of memory. And Dr. Minner's done a lot of interesting work actually in her career so far. She kind of generally studies urban change and community memory. She's done this from a number of different angles, it seems. She's got examinations of methods for studying the built environment, sustainable adaptation, all sorts of kind of pressing and important topics of the moment. She has publications in urban studies, the Journal of the American Planning Association, and a number of other prestigious outlets. The thing that stuck out to me when I was looking at her CV and kind of chatting with her at the moment, she also does a lot of work directly engaged in the community with nonprofits and things that we don't necessarily always see academics doing. So that's an interesting aspect to her work that doesn't always necessarily come through in our colloquiums that we'll hear about today, I think, a little bit as well. And as per usual, she's won a number of different awards and things like this that I won't embarrass her by listing, although maybe she would like me to do so. However, I will pass the mic over to her, metaphorically speaking, because she's been mic'd up and I'm just holding this one. And we'll listen to her talk and open up for questions at the end. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Minner.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I want to thank Elizabeth Wentz, David Handula, Nicholas Ray, and many others who have already hosted me so well. I really appreciate it. And it's an honor to be here. Again, I'm visiting from Cornell, which is in New York State. So many of you who have not visited Cornell may think of this, the Isle of Manhattan. And we do have somewhat of a presence in New York City. However, this is my commute into work. The weather and traffic report from Ithaca, New York, which is a small city in upstate New York. And so it's a real pleasure to be here to enjoy what is very nice weather for me. As mentioned before, some of my work focuses on community preservation. I also teach land use and spatial planning and technology. And I'm interested in areas of convergence, tension, and synergy between historic preservation and land use planning. I'm interested in how building reuse and cultural landscape preservation can inform land use planning, how preservation and community development can become better allies, and sometimes they are. How can we effectively and ethically apply technology in our quest toward sustainable and especially equitable communities? And I'm interested in creative and critical approaches to technology. And I wanted to mention a few other projects before I get to the point or the topic, because I'm partially here selfishly because I'd like to find collaborators. I love to work with people at other organizations. This is an example. The Equity Preservation and Planning workshop that I taught a couple of years ago, a partner was the Preservation Green Lab of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So in this particular project, we looked at the Atlas of Reurbanism, which is, and I don't know how many of you have taken a look at this resource. I see at least one nod. This is an effort of the National Trust to look at the Jane Jacobs theory that older, smaller buildings and a mix of building types adds to urban vitality. So students in my course looked at what the National Trust calls the character score, taking a look not only at the building stock underlying the character score, but interviewing community leaders and looking at spatial patterns, both geographies of disinvestment within Buffalo, and then where reinvestment was happening, mapping things like building permits and demolition patterns. Another project that I'm working on at the moment looks at scenario planning. So we're testing in the context of sea level rise along the Massachusetts coast, what processes and what scenario planning tools can incorporate fiscal analysis in the face of climate change. So students in my land use class today are testing GeoDesign Hub, which is a scenario planning tool, and also applying this year Urban Footprint. And then one other project that I'll mention with collaborators at the University of Texas at Austin, my alma mater, where we looked at developing an index to look for transit corridors to prioritize for affordable housing preservation. So this is a tool and a curriculum that we developed, which is available online. Okay, so what's the point? What are mega events? Anyone, what is a mega event? What might I mean by this term?
The Olympics.
The Olympics, yes. Anything else? Now I'm going to define them quite broadly. International expositions or World's Fairs, or I'll call them interchangeably expos, are basically core samples of urban development that I've been focused on. But more broadly, can you think of other events that are similar? How about, what's that?
Chicago Fire? Oh, I was just thinking about the Chicago Fire. When you mentioned the World Trade Fair, the exposition.
Okay, yeah, exactly. I'm also thinking of South by Southwest, smaller festivals that also have an impact on cities. How many of you have been to an expo? Which one?
I'm dating myself, but
That's
Expo
okay.
67 in Montreal.
Oh, that's great. Anyone else?
I've been to one when I was a child, but I honestly don't remember which one.
Okay, great. And how many of you have been on the site of a former World's Fair? So a few of you. Shout them out.
San Francisco.
San Francisco. Okay.
Treasure Island.
Okay, Treasure Island. Great. We're getting more in depth than this. I expected a few people to know. The Eiffel Tower, for instance, is from the 1889 World's Fair. But there are many other examples. The Seattle Center, for instance, in Seattle, Washington, is the site of the 1962 World's Fair. And there have been all sorts of international expositions through time, and the spatial distribution of them has changed quite dramatically from being focused initially on European and North American countries and Australia to now, more recently, expositions in China, for instance, one held recently in Astana, and now we have World's Fairs being held in Dubai and in the future, Osaka. So I heard at least one person mention the 1893 World's Fair, or World's Columbian Exposition, which is canonical in planning history, as being the sort of origin of, or at least broadcasting the ideal of the city beautiful, as popularized in The Devil in the White City. And there are other great novels, Margaret Creighton's novel, for instance, about called The Electrifying Fall of the Rainbow City, which is focused on Buffalo. I personally imprinted it as a child on the site of the 1962 World's Fair. So the Seattle Center, the Space Needle, the US Pavilion designed by Minoru Yamasaki, who also designed the World Trade Center, and Pruitt Igoe, created a very whimsical landscape that many people have become attached to. And there are many other examples, some of which the Eiffel Tower, I like to think of the Space Needle in those terms, and other sites like the Tower of the Americas in San Antonio, the Tower of the Sun in Osaka, the Sun Sphere in Knoxville, and Brisbane's Sky Needle. Many of them you might only know if you've lived in that city. And these are landmarks that identify the city, and expos are space creating entities. So early on, while I was at the University of Texas at Austin, I became involved in an organization called DocoMoMo, which is Documentation and Conservation of the Modern Movement, and was an advocate for preservation at the site of the 1968 World's Fair. When I went to Cornell, I then took this question of what happens to these World's Fair sites over time and how can they be sustainably adapted? Looking across 4 1960s era World's Fair sites in Seattle, Montreal, San Antonio, and Queens, in New York City, Flushing Meadows. And we applied and received funding from the US Department of the Interior to model Test City Engine as a tool for both design purposes and understanding change through time. More recently, I've been involved in looking at these sites through an artistic lens, collaborating with an artist by the name of Jade Dosko. And through my classes, trying to understand what are the qualities of public space following in the wake of these mega events, who plans, conserves, and adapts these sites, how are histories from before and during the expo represented in the landscape, and what are post-event dynamics in the reshaping of urban places, of these urban places and public spaces. So these event spaces are roadmaps, not only to the design innovations of the time, but of ideologies and social hierarchies. So if you look at, for instance, fair designs, you can learn a lot by their organization. And the sort of ordering of sectors and representations of nations, states, cities, people, and corporations. And the production of these spaces not only reflects ideas of a particular time and ideology, but they involve the reshaping of cities and systems, including infrastructure like transport. They often produce new public green spaces, and these spur changes in and around the event spaces. And in the production of expo sites, there has been, in many cases, massive displacement, which is a part of this picture. I'll talk a little bit more in depth about Hemisphere 68 in San Antonio, which involved the displacement of about 1,600 people and over 600 businesses. But there are other sites in that era, Brisbane, which is another case, Vancouver, Spokane, and Seattle, and then the Olympic displacements, which are quite astounding, including 1.5 million people displaced by this count for the Beijing Olympics, and 18,000 households displaced for the Shanghai 2010 Expo. So globally, these expositions and the Olympics continue to be produced and shape cities. They're not one-off events, but massive undertakings which have long-term consequences for the host cities. So lessons from these prior expos about what happens to the urban spaces that are created and issues in their management over time, and what is remembered, I think, is very relevant for urban planning. These are just a quick sample of mega event sites from around the world, from New York's 1939 World's Fair site, which is also the site of the 64, to sites in Japan and Brisbane, Australia, Spain, etc. And these all have different orientations. There's an aspect of urban morphology, too complex to talk about all in one take here, but that have to do with the orientation of these sites to central business districts, to waterfronts, and different ideas of how to plan cities and use mega events. So each of these sites has impact, what I like to think of as impact craters that are spatial, they're physical, and they're also social. So in a recent publication by me and Martin Abbott, who is a PhD student who I collaborate with, we have written about conservation logics that reshape mega event spaces using San Antonio, Texas, and Brisbane as an example. In this paper, we compare Hemisphere 68, which took place in 1968, the theme of which was the confluence of the civilizations of the Americas, and it was at the 350th anniversary of the founding of San Antonio. The other case is World Expo 1988, the theme being leisure in the age of technology, and it was at Australia's bicentennial. So for these expos to be considered official, they need a theme, and they're usually tied to some important date for the host city. In San Antonio, this was the first international exposition held in the US South. The theme, as I mentioned before, celebrated the confluence of North and South Americas, which was an expression of Pan-Americanism at the time, and there was a sort of local identity rooted in Spanish colonial and Mexican cultural heritage that was packaged for the external world. The photo at the right shows the crowds at the World's Fair, and a group who performed an ancient ritual dance from Veracruz, Mexico, and 5 men represented the 5 elements of the indigenous world, or the 5 elements of the indigenous world climb to the top of the pole. One of them stays playing a flute and dancing while the other 4 descend the pole. And so these kinds of themed entertainments were a part of the fair. These are images from Brisbane's 1988 World's Fair, which similarly had cultural entertainment and was called a sort of coming of age for Brisbane, and is attributed with bringing a sort of new food culture and outdoor entertainments. So in this particular project, we looked at the conservation of space and retention of buildings and other objects post-Expo to understand the continuing evolution of urban spaces. And there's some really good books already about both expos by Jackie Ryan, Mary Gannis, Gonzalez has written about designing Pan America. There's also underpinning this research work on mega event spaces. John and Margaret Gold have done a lot of work on place promotion and rebranding of host cities through expos. The space creating and space filling legacies and history of urban greening that has been done by Maurice Roche, and work on the entrepreneurial city and restructuring of urban space. So in this case, what we tried to do was look at retained objects and to understand vignettes that reveal the roles of individual actors in retaining these objects. So we looked at how conservation, very broadly defined, from just retaining an object to adapting it and relocating it, of artwork, buildings, and space constitutes a force for continued urban development. So many people think of preservation as something that sort of keeps things stagnant. In this case, we found the retention of these objects as being a bit more dynamic. So we looked at artwork, parklands and gardens, buildings that were retained but built before the expo and for the expo, in both iconic and ordinary structures. So we looked at how actors enacted social memories to advocate, retain, or conserve buildings and structures and artworks at the expo sites, and how that influenced urban development. And this is a photo of Sherry Kafka Wagner, who was the wife of the man who designed the Women's Pavilion at Hemisphere Park. Very interesting story, just that building alone. On the face of this building are the handprints of the prominent women who were involved in the construction of this Women's Pavilion. And this is just one story that we looked at, and one object rather poorly retained, but retained in San Antonio. So these are roughly comparable sites, even though they're 20 years apart. Similar sort of planning tactics were used. So this involved redevelopment nearly, but not completely, tabula rasa. So the demolition of entire spaces. In San Antonio's case, this was a neighborhood, the Germantown neighborhood and surrounds that was deemed blighted and was removed. And in Brisbane, it was an industrial maritime district, a sort of port area, and a working class neighborhood around that area. So in San Antonio, federal urban renewal funds were used in the creation of Hemisphere 68, the event space. And if you look sort of past this opaque area, you can see the streets and the buildings that were removed for the event space. And if you go to the archives or you look online, there are pages and pages of photos of individual buildings. And it's quite poignant. In some cases, you'll see kids out front playing, but most of these buildings were demolished to make way for the expo. In Brisbane, there was also a resumption, as I mentioned before, of industrial waterfront uses and a working class neighborhood. This image is from a protest film called City for Sale, which was recently digitized and made available online by the State Library of Queensland. And in both cases, there were a few buildings that were retained and incorporated into the expo. This includes about 22 or 24, depending on how you count it, 19th and early 20th century buildings that were used as sort of saloons and in concessions at the San Antonio site, and a few also used as pubs, or I think this was Spaghetti House for a while, and a police station. So there's lots of similarities too between the city and the metro population now, between San Antonio and Brisbane. The original site or size of the expo was quite similar at between 96 and 99 acres. There are also similarities in current uses. There are convention centers at both sites. And similar uses, although more dedicated parkland in the case of Brisbane. Government ownership and management is similar between the two, with an emphasis on private development around the site. And then contemporary planning tactics are also quite similar for repurposing the site, including sustainability initiatives, a focus on mixed-use development and improvements to park space. And both sites now serve a sort of mix of tourists and locals. So this is the Hemisphere site now, well, a few years ago. And these are pages of the master plan that show some of the objects left over from Hemisphere, including the Tower of the Americas and the Women's Pavilion. And the master plan, which shows the repurposing of this land for mixed use rather than the former US Pavilion, which is a landmarked structure, and the former Texas Pavilion as park space or mixed use space. So in other words, although these modern architectural features have been landmarked, there's questions as to whether they'll be retained in the long term. And there's been quite a reshaping of public space. This is the convention center on site. And if you look closely, a new addition is built over here. There's demolition here and a reshaping of the Hemisphere site for more park space. So I want to talk a little bit about the Brisbane site and the objects left over from Brisbane. This is a shot of the South Bank parklands with a constructed beachfront, various restaurant uses, a boardwalk all along the Brisbane River, and you can see massive redevelopment, university uses, luxury apartments, etc. So in researching what was left over at this expo site, you come across very sweet stories. This is the Nepalese Peace Pagoda, which was a structure that was special to begin with. It was constructed in the Kathmandu Valley by 300 carvers and artisans from 160 Nepalese families. It was constructed abroad and then shipped to Australia and constructed on site. It is the sole example of a peace pagoda outside of Nepal, other than one located in Munich for an International Garden Expo. And at the end of Expo 88, plans had been set in motion to sell the pagoda to a Japanese buyer at the close of 1988. And there was a whole campaign to try to save it, which was broadcast, and local, state, and federal government all pledged funding, but they required the public to come up with $50,000. 30,000. So at the very last day, there was a broadcast on TV about the potential for this peace pagoda to be sold off. And a retired couple, Frank and Myra Pitt, were sitting around watching the evening news. And this is when Frank turned to his wife, Myra, and he has said on video, when you have so unusual an icon, you grab it with both hands, you hang on to it. So we did that. And I said to Myra, she doesn't always agree with me, I said, did you hear that on TV? She said, yeah. I said, why don't we put the money in it? And she said, yes. And just like that, laughing and smiling, it shocked me. So they put $30,000 of their retirement funds, which was a lot for them, and this is 1989, into preserving the pagoda. And what's happened over time are people become attached to it. This is John McGregor, who founded an organization called Celebrate 88. And Expo 88 was his first job out of high school. So he really imprinted on the expo itself. And so after the expo, a few years later, he would go to the pagoda, he would give free tours, basically inhabit this pagoda. And if you go online, there's hundreds of videos that he and a colleague have put together on the history of the different structures left over from the expo. So this is an example of a history advocate sort of orbiting and narrating objects. A less personal or emotive gesture emerges in the conservation of Collins Place. So you might remember a few slides back, a sort of forlorn-looking 19th century building. Well, this is Collins Place restored and actually hoisted 9 meters up into the air. It was heritage designated, so there was a requirement to retain it, but this sort of controversial solution was proposed and approved of hoisting it up on pilotis and putting a burger joint down below, and now it's a pub, and two, I think it's 6-story towers sort of dwarf the structure a bit in the luxury development of South Point. It's actually 2 14-story contemporary towers. And similar sort of conservation logics appear in the retention of the sky needle, which was also purported to have been almost sold off for Disney Tokyo, but it was retained by the entrepreneur Stephen Ackery, and is also heritage listed and incorporated as a sort of theme structure for an apartment building. The final example of a sort of heritage object or conservation logic is in the Queensland Cultural Centre, which is on the edge of the Expo lands. And this was designed by Robert Gibson and a coalition of the Australian Institute of Architects who were concerned about a proposal for a tower to be built on top of it, and also neighborhood residents organized to get this listed. And it has shaped what has happened on the edge of the Expo site. So in comparing the two, in both examples, we see conservation as a force shaping change and examples of modern architecture as heritage, which from my perspective is very interesting. And if you look at these maps, even though they were largely redeveloped with only a few heritage objects retained, these heritage designations shape what can be built on the site. And in Brisbane's case, originally there was a proposal for the Queensland state government to sell off the site to private developers, to be a casino, to be other private development, but the citizens organized for its retention as parkland. So there's a much bigger story here. So in Hemisphere, there's more built remnants from the Expo, which are landmarked, but the future of the landmarked buildings is much less certain. In Brisbane, fewer landmarks, but the retentions have been incorporated into mixed use and public spaces, and there's been more success in conservation-led or citizen-led conservation of parklands. So in this case and in this article, I won't go into any great detail here, but we looked at applying a preservation discourse matrix, which basically looks at the intrinsic value of the object according to the actor, from these heritage objects being perceived as being tangible, physical, a sort of curatorial orientation to the object, to more flexible and social and cultural interpretation, the intangible value of the object. And then from monetized or public good and inclusive market orientation to a more monetized or instrumental or private good orientation. We also built on that, looking at the geographic or environmental control around the object, from the intention to save the object itself, to retention of the object for maintaining the character of the surrounding urban fabric, to retaining an object to maintain the identity of the city, to an imaginary or state or nation. And then looking at these examples on an orientation toward development, from resistance to development to attraction, or trying to attract developments, and additional logics associated with thrift and neglect. So we found some interesting things, I think, looking at the value of understanding microdynamics and attachments to even small objects, artwork, trees, and buildings. And both with and without formal protections, these objects enable sort of vectors of influence or forces of conservation to shape not only what is remembered as history in the present, but infuse what the urban spaces become in the future. So that was looking at what was retained. We've also looked at how urban spaces forget. So there are triumphant messages that can obscure difficult histories associated with these sites and other sites, such as the histories of displacement. Communities are lost, and the physical reminders of them can be swept away. However, my contention is that these histories should be remembered actively and publicly. And many of the most important forms of preserving memory are through media, archives, and art, not always and only through the preservation of buildings and objects. So these are a couple of Expo protest films. I've been interviewing filmmakers associated with these. This came out of a women's film workshop. Another independent feature. But I want to end with what I found to be a really profoundly important example of a public art installation that took a really creative path towards seeking to remind and remember. So here I'm going to end with a few excerpts from a couple of manuscripts of my own and another co-authored with Martin Abbott, who I mentioned before, who helped me to gather information at two of four international exposition sites that I visited in Australia. And I should also add that I've been corresponding with the artist Jonathan Jones to try to understand the many layers of this installation, and received permission to share these images with you. So this is part of my research on memory and change at the site of mega events, but also what can planners and preservationists and perhaps geographers learn from artists and socially engaged art. So in September 2016, Jonathan Jones placed 15,000 Aboriginal broadshields in a ghostly outline of the mostly forgotten Garden Palace at the Royal Botanic Gardens in the heart of Sydney, Australia. The once massive Garden Palace was constructed to house the Sydney International Exhibition of 1879. Inside the ornate and carefully crafted structure were all manner of pavilions and courts meant to impress, entertain, and educate the masses. The ethnological court, for example, contained a panoply of Aboriginal artifacts, mostly consisting of a meticulous display of weapons. The curated collection, through choice of objects and the gendered omission of any material culture associated with women, portrayed Australia's Aboriginal people as warring, savage, and on their way to extinction. Among the knives, axes, spears, and animal skins were human remains. This so-called palace of culture was a racialized stab at superiority and control. Just a few years later, the Garden Palace was burned to the ground in a fire, and the collection of human remains and traditional cultural objects were destroyed. Jones, a member of the Wiradjuri and Kamilaroi nations of southeastern Australia, sought to revive this history, which had been largely forgotten in the public imagination. The 2016 public art installation, Barangal Jara, Skin and Bones, laid this out in a monumental and also temporary display. Although the public art is striking in aerial views, Jones meant it to be a participatory experience on the ground and in community. Performances, talks, and soundscapes created within the installation broadcast repeating words in Aboriginal languages. The soundscapes of languages were laid out on the site according to the relative cardinal directions of Aboriginal communities within Australia. The soundscapes were produced through the involvement of community members from each of the groups. In one example, Gadigal women recited words in the Sydney language to the sound of the ocean. There were also invigilators, and these were primarily university students who stood around the installation to protect the shields, but more importantly, to interact with the public. And Jonathan said they had really amazing conversations, as the site is a major thoroughfare connecting the city to the east. So the project generated a lot of frank and open discussions with the general public about art and culture away from the galleries and universities. A number of the group were young Aboriginal students that were employed specifically to work on the project, which was important as they were inheritors of these histories. During the process, they exposed themselves, their histories and stories to the public every day. And we had a lot of discussions about how to handle difficult or harmful situations. They weren't expected to declare Aboriginality. If they wanted to, they could just have an apolitical conversation about the Garden Palace, and they didn't have a script or anything of that kind. They simply shared from their perspective the importance of it. So the art installation and the set of events and performances offers a means of considering how lost memories might be more than simply remembered. They can become a new forum for processing of memory. And so this is where an interesting sort of interaction happens between the statue of Governor Phillip, the first governor of New South Wales, and the Aboriginal shields. The statue was intended to shape the meaning and national pride and represents a dominant narrative of control. Thus, the art installation encircling the space is not only a counter-narrative to that settler narrative, but a means of capturing public attention and renewing public discourse around Australia's Aboriginal and colonial histories. So I want to end with some shots of the beautiful exhibition catalog that came out of this installation, and also encourage you to take a look at the 5-part series about this public installation. Jonathan Jones has done a lot of other amazing artwork, but I think this is particularly relevant to the question of interpretations of history and culture, and really offered a very profound way of interpreting that history and that event space. So in conclusion, not only do these mega event sites have impact craters that evolve, but it's fascinating how preservation and conservation is a sort of active and dynamic force, sometimes weak though, and how these places can be active reservoirs for the remembrance and processing of history and the production of our, hopefully, ethical orientation toward the future. So, thank you. And I'd like to open it up for questions.
Yeah, so we certainly have some time for a few questions. I'll come around with the mic, so if you just want to raise your hand for questions. Questions? Anyone? Oh, Oscar has a question.
So the organizers of these mega events, if they're the ones who are selecting where the next event will be, then what kind of responsibility do they have, and how can they activate on achieving like equity and creating these events in a like more sustainable way?
That's an excellent question. So what I didn't say is the Bureau of International Expositions in Paris oversees the officially sanctioned expositions all over the world. And there is a selection process, and they do consider legacy and sustainability. In fact, they've released some reports that are quite proud of the sustainability aspects of the expo. And so there's at least lip service that is basically, there is discussion of sustainability, and host cities are, in their bids to become an official expo, do incorporate sustainability within their plans. That's not to say that more couldn't be done. And certainly both the Bureau of International Expositions and the International Olympic Committee, or IOC, considers legacy, and they are aware of the negative aspects of these events and the displacement. I think at minimum it would be really important for these organizations to directly answer to the question of displacement. And they've sort of been forced to think about legacy and these issues because of growing protests to mega events. And certainly that's been highly publicized in the case of the Olympics. I think there's much more awareness about Olympic events, at least among the US population, because we haven't paid dues to the BIE until very recently. Under the Trump administration, we rejoined as a member country. So yeah, I think these national bodies have a lot of responsibility, and the host cities also have the responsibility for not just saying that they're going to emphasize sustainability or that they're going to address affordable housing issues. I mean, that's a huge issue when you have an event site that, maybe it doesn't displace people directly. In these cases, it did. But let's say you don't, you still have the potential for indirect displacement as property values rise around an event space. So there's definitely an ethical responsibility moving forward. And then the interesting thing about tracing what happens to prior sites is that you see so many examples, and this happened in San Antonio and Brisbane, where they created the event space, and then there were multiple failed attempts to sort of make a vibrant public space. And so there's a whole host of urban management and preservation questions. So it's not just the event, there's what's leading up to the event, and then the long history of the space that's been created. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So have you looked at any of these mega events under kind of a more recent context, like I think of Seoul or maybe Rio de Janeiro, I think was another recent, or was it the World Cup?
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. It's these cities that we know there was displacement, or we know there was these kind of ripple factors that happened when these mega events occurred. Are you kind of watching how those, I guess, transform now, what I would almost say immediately after the event is concluded?
That hasn't been my focus because I've tried to differentiate my research in terms of looking at prior or former event sites over time. However, there is a lot of great research being done. And in fact, there was a series at the International Planning History Society conference in Japan this past year with a couple of panels that looked at questions, those questions precisely. So Maurice Roche, John and Margaret Gold, many other researchers are looking at these questions of displacement with more recent sites. And I am also interested in them and interested in the question of how one can ethically and sustainably create new sites, because they will continue to be generated. So this is an interesting planning problem for students in my land use planning class, for instance. Yeah.
Thanks, that was really interesting. So both of these cities are pretty thriving. Have you looked at any that aren't so, and are there differences in what happens to the sites?
Yeah, many of the sites, such as Seattle, Montreal, San Antonio, Brisbane, yes, absolutely thriving. I'm trying to think of a context of a city selected that doesn't have those same pressures. Even Knoxville, which there's perhaps my favorite Simpsons episode, shows the Knoxville site afterwards. But Knoxville, I think, is pretty thriving too. So that's a good question. I'm not sure how Astana is doing after the 2017 Expo, so that might be a good site to do that. I think the cities that tend to get these, to be able to host these events, tend to be fairly thriving. So Buffalo, for instance, hasn't had an expo since 1901. But that, and I can't think of any other legacies that have successfully bid for this type of expo. But if other people can think of them, I'd be interested.
My thought was Buffalo.
Okay.
With the Pan.
My thought was Buffalo with the Pan American, and that's I can't think of anything that was preserved. Well, some of the buildings around the park and things like that.
Yeah,
but
the
everything else
Albright
is now in
Knox.
neighborhood. Yeah.
So now it is a fairly wealthy neighborhood, a residential subdivision, and they have a sign celebrating the Pan American Exposition. And then there's the History Center that was a pavilion, and the Albright Knox Art Museum, which was originally it was supposed to be the Palace of, I think, Fine Art, but it wasn't done in time, so it was completed in 1905. So with these earlier sites, there are often small remnants, but they often sort of disappear with only the smallest objects left, like in the case of the Sydney, well, the Royal Botanic Garden is a sort of legacy space, but there aren't structures left over from the expo.
Any further questions? No? Well, I could ask you all to join me in thanking Dr. Minner for her wonderful presentation.